Welcome to the chaos sector. We return to the Matrix. Well, we might as well just do a freaking documentary on Kamala Harris at this point, because the wheels have long flew off the vehicle, and she's riding down the street with sparks flying on the rotors, about to set herself on fire. It's unprecedented, which is crazy as hell, because we thought Old Joe was the worst thing we've seen so far. Harris tells Old Joe, though, no hold my beer. Adding to the problems she faces in this presidential cycle, she has just added a few more. Let me tell you something. If the IRS is endorsing you, that's not a good sign. Well, for a communist's administration, yeah, why not? Now, why would the IRS come out and endorse Kamala Harris? Well, I guess they have something in common, making citizens poorer by stealing their money. But the report claims that the IRS endorsed Harris due to boosting the budget of the agency by $80 billion. Of course, in the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't think that's the reason. It's more sinister than that. We'll dig a bit deeper into the specifics. I'm assuming it obviously doesn't bode well for citizens in a Harris-Walz communist administration. Think about it. A federal government agency known for taking money from citizens throughout the year is endorsing a presidential candidate, trying to convince those citizens to vote for her. Absolutely bonkers. Kamala Harris has made another boo-boo, as she blabbers out more absurd gibberish. And I literally mean absurd gibberish. Old Joe's gibberish was discernible to some degree, as he was attempting to explain himself and just lost his train of thought. But Harris, on the other hand, is not suffering from memory loss, dementia, or any typical elderly ailments. She is suffering from a disorder that affects any age, and that would be an airhead. In a recent interview with MSNBC's Stephanie Ruhle, Harris may have just solidified Trump's victory. We would break it down in a transcript, but it's actually depressing. Ruhle, despite trying to hold Harris's hand through the interview with her softball pitches, couldn't save Harris from the abyss. After the interview, Ruhle even admitted that Harris dodged questions and doesn't really give firm answers. I'll tell you what, let's briefly give a bit of it. Now, this is from MSNBC's website. They were so kind to provide a transcript of this monumental failure. We're going to skip down to the key point, where there is a statement about voters favoring Trump's economic plan over Harris. Now, before this, Harris was blabbering about sweet nothings. Quote, I think we can't and we wouldn't aspire to have an economy that just allows people to get by. People want to do more than just get by. They want to get ahead. And I come from the middle class. Look, my mother raised my sister and me. She worked hard. She saved up. By the time I was a teenager, she was able to buy our first home. And homeownership for too many people in our country now is elusive, you know? Gone is the day of everyone thinking they could actually live the American dream. So part of my vision for the economy is, let's deal with some of the everyday challenges that people face and address them with common sense solutions, such as affordable housing, unquote. Ruhle then asked Harris, quote, over the last 4 years, there have been tremendous economic wins. And you have just laid out a big plan. Unquote. Harris responds, quote, yes, unquote. Ruhle then asked Harris, quote, but still, polling shows that most likely voters still think Donald Trump is better to handle the economy. Why do you think that is? Unquote. Harris responds, quote, well, here's what I know in terms of the facts. Donald Trump left us with the worst economy since the Great Depression when you look at it, for example, the employment numbers, unquote. By the way, they mean unemployment. Ruhle challenges this. Quote, it was during Clover, and unemployment was so high because we shut down the government, we shut down the country, unquote. Harris, quote, even before the pandemic, he lost manufacturing jobs, by most people's estimates, at least 200,000. He lost manufacturing plants. Ask the auto workers how he lost auto plants. We have grown over 20 new auto plants. He has an agenda. Let's just deal with it right now going forward, not to mention what happened in the past. Unquote. Now we'll stop right here because Harris is sitting in that chair, flat out lying to the American people. Ruhle already knows Harris is lying and didn't fact check her on any of this nonsense. First off, the so-called auto plants built were for electric vehicles, and they're unreliable. This administration did nothing to bring back auto manufacturing jobs. The built Ford Tough variety, you see? Trump did not lose 200,000 auto manufacturing jobs. Even CNN fact-checked her. I guess at this point they have to, because she is literally melting under the heat of the orange puppet. Quote, Vice President Kamala Harris made a false claim about the jobs record of her Republican opponent, former President Donald Trump, in an interview on MSNBC on Wednesday evening. Interviewer Stephanie Rule asked Harris what she thought about polls that show most likely voters still think Trump is the better option on handling the economy. Now, we don't need to go over it. We have the actual transcript of what she said, but it's right here verbatim on CNN. We scroll down to the fact check. Quote, Harris's claim is false. Trump presided over a gain of 414,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs, not a loss of at least 200,000 before the Clover pandemic hit. And the loss for his entire presidency, start to finish, was 178,000 manufacturing jobs, not 200,000 or more, as Harris said. National job totals rise and fall for many reasons, other than who the president is. Even if you're attributing all gains and losses to the president, though, it's just not true that Trump lost at least 200,000 manufacturing jobs before the pandemic. Unquote. Now, CNN wasn't going to fact-check Harris without providing, quote, context to that statement. They went on to basically say, she misspoke. Yeah, she misspoke, all right. Being a false claim. Anywho, that's enough of that, because if we continued with that transcript, I might lose my mind. She had no economic plan other than to raise taxes on the wealthy and corporations, provide up to $6,000 in child tax credits, propose $25,000 federal grants for first-time home buyers, and up to $50,000 in tax deductions for small businesses and entrepreneurs. But wait, you may say, well, that seems like a comprehensive and efficient economic plan for American citizens. Oh, really? You think so? How about we break it down as we did prior? Raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations has never worked. It's that type of socialist ideology that leads to the very economic crisis right now. It's the Democrats' attempt at appealing to the working-class citizens, but it always ends up hurting them the most. Because wealthy people, who happen to also be business owners, will shrink their staff, raise costs to make up for the tax increase, which could lead to bankruptcy. Or they'll relocate. The same with corporations. They will raise costs to make up for the tax increase, or relocate. Meanwhile, this realignment will only impact the communities who, by the way, aren't receiving tax cuts neither. So what type of economy is this? A crisis. Or what about proposing to give $6,000 in child tax credits? Sounds nice to those parents. But if they carefully examine this, it will basically be ripped out of their hands on the other end of Harris's radical spending. And mind you, this is at the end of the tax year, not during the year of working. So by the time you do receive this child tax credit, you've spent more for gas, car insurance, rent, and other utility bills. And also keep in mind, the IRS can claim you owe taxes, so it's not a guarantee that you will get up to $6,000 in child tax credit. Can't trust the IRS, man. They're not for the American people. But they sure find Harris to be quite the buddy. See, it would be different if Harris proposed to cut taxes for the American people, where they're bringing home an additional $300 in total monthly income. For example, an employee has a tax cut of $75 every pay cycle, which totals to $300 in monthly additional income. Now, this is a small gift, but when you add that to the monthly income of many households, such as the lower and middle class households, that additional $300 a month really helps out. Also, the younger generations could really use that additional monthly income. I mean, it's just $75 in tax cuts for anyone making less than $400,000 annually, right? Oh, but Harris proposes to invest billions of dollars elsewhere. If you recall, Nancy Pelosi came out and called Trump's tax cuts for the American people, quote, crumbs. But every single person was pleased with those tax cuts because adding money is always better than subtracting it. You see, Democrats will never help the American people when it comes to putting more money in their pockets. They play economic semantic games, dangling money all around the citizens' bank accounts, but not actually putting it in there. You understand? Kamala Harris needs to stop having interviews because she's running out of ways to duck and dodge. In fact, might as well be grilled by Fox News at this point. At least you can say you took on the challenge. It's becoming worse that she's being carried by left-wing media, as every time they hold her hand through the interviews, it's magnified how she can't answer even their questions. But let's touch on another recent brain boggler regarding Kamala Harris. Apparently, Harris is hesitant to answer if she still supports decriminalizing prostitution. If there is hesitance, especially on an issue such as this, it's safe to say that Harris supports it, but is afraid to adamantly say it now as she's running for president. You see, this is the problem. Imagine a presidential candidate in a debate asked about her stance on the issue. Vice President Harris, in the past, you have supported the efforts to decriminalize prostitution across the board. Do you still hold that view? Listen, first I want to state that women should be respected and treated with dignity. I also want to add that this issue does not... Okay, you blabbering fuck. Sorry, I apologize for that outburst. Let's all regroup. Vice President Harris, in 2019, you were asked, do you think sex work should be decriminalized? And you stated, quote, I think so. I do. Unquote. As of 2024, and as Vice President of the United States, do you still hold that view about prostitution? Okay, let's be respectful, and I ask that you refer to these women as sex workers. As a district attorney of San Francisco, I advocated then that we need to stop arresting prostitutes, sex workers, and instead go after the Johns and the pimps, because we are criminalizing the women and not the individuals who have provoked this lifestyle in many cases. Many young women are forced into sex work by drug addiction, fear, family abandonment, and men take advantage of those women for their own personal gain. Okay, you won't directly answer the question, so I take it that you do want to decriminalize prostitution. It's called sex work. Stop insulting them. That's pretty much how that would go in the debate. It's quite immoral and unsophisticated for a vice president and presidential candidate to support decriminalizing prostitution. What does that say to young women? What does that say to the mothers of young women and teenagers? So, of course, as always, Harris has done the electric slide away from that ideology, but she had already gave her stance on it, so we have to tack that on with the rest of her far-left progressive views. Yet for verification, we review an Axios article on this issue. Quote, Vice President Harris's campaign is declining to say whether she still supports decriminalizing sex work, a position she took while running for president in 2019. Why it matters. It's among several progressive stances Harris has either abandoned or gone silent on as she's moved toward the center in her abbreviated race for the White House. Okay, that's not true. Harris hasn't moved to the center because the fucking current policies tell you where she stands. It's just issues like this, along with other ideals that are consequential in her presidential campaign, she slithers away from for the votes. But anyway, driving the news in February 2019, The Root asked Harris whether she thought sex work ought to be decriminalized. She responded, quote, I think so. I do, unquote. When you're talking about consenting adults, I think that, yes, we should really consider that we can't criminalize consensual behavior as long as no one is being harmed, she said. Harris added that people in sex work who hurt another human being or profits off of their exploitation should be criminally prosecuted. Well, I guess she will crack down on Hollywood, the music industry, the porn industry. Every element of exploiting women sexually should be criminally prosecuted. Yeah, we know that's not going to happen. Harris also told The Root that when she was district attorney for San Francisco, quote, I was advocating then that we need to stop arresting these prostitutes and instead go after the Johns and the pimps because we were criminalizing the women. Unquote. Okay, there's a bit more to the article, but we stop here for a moment and unpack all of this garbage on Harris's doorstep. First off, no matter how you coin it, a woman having sex for money is not the best example of women empowerment. You know why? Because that woman is being subjugated to the same, quote, male bigotry that the left, especially woke feminists, blabber about. So despite trying to desensitize the triggering effect of the term prostitution, the woman is still being subjugated in this so-called occupation. That's number one. Second, of course, Harris will attempt to slide away from that stance, which was her stance in 2019, and you wonder why she was unpopular? We can suggest most women voters were not too happy with that view because it lacks class. Third, when she says, quote, we should really consider that we can't criminalize consensual behavior, is her stance. It's clear as day she supports decriminalizing prostitution. So the question is actually irrelevant, but it's the dirt in her closet that's coming back to stain her new wardrobe. Fourth, people in sex work who hurt another being or profits off of their exploitation should be criminally prosecuted is literally insane. Mind you, this is not the sex worker she is referring to. This is apparently the sex worker's, quote, agent or manager. We know these individuals as pimps or sex traffickers, but here's the thing. As long as they don't hurt the sex workers physically or exploit them, everything's okay. But exploiting them is how they make their money, right? In what context is she using exploitation? The action of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work, or the action of making use of and benefiting from resources? Even in the first definition, how would Harris determine if the sex worker is being treated unfairly? Who would the sex worker contact about this issue? The Workforce Commission. She'll send some IRS auditor of the manager and see if the profits of the sex worker are being equally paid out to the worker for her labor in connection to how much the manager takes out. Oh, that's why the IRS endorsed Harris. Hey, I see it all clear as day. It's a circus show. But let's continue with more. Quote, the American Civil Liberties Union argued in 2023 that the criminalization of sex work makes sex workers more vulnerable to violence on the job and less likely to report violence. Wait, job? The only job they have is... I had to take that joke. It was right there for the taking. The reason they are claiming this is because when prostitutes get arrested, they are in jail and costing the pimp time and money. So when they get out, well, they face violence. But see, they're trying to hide the element of the pimp in this equation. You see, they are framing this as if the sex workers are independent contractors who work for themselves and don't have to answer to anyone else. That's not reality, my friends. All of them have a man behind them or even other women who oversee their job. And another issue here is Civil Liberties Union. You do know that this is the same ACLU, right? The same ACLU that actually argued against the Communications Decency Act. The Communications Decency Act was an attempt to protect minors from explicit material on the internet by criminalizing knowing transmission of obscene or indecent messages to any recipient under 18, and also knowingly sending to a person under 18 anything that in context depicts or describes in terms patently offensive as measured by contemporary community standards, sexual or excretory activities or organs. The ACLU argued that certain parts of the act were facially unconstitutional and sought a preliminary injunction, preventing the government from enforcing those provisions. The fact that the ACLU argued against this, regardless of any discrepancies, shows that the Liberty and American Civil Liberties Union was taken too far, which of course devolved into what we know now as liberalism. Keep in mind, the Communications Decency Act attempted to regulate pornographic material on the internet. That was the basis of the proposed bill. And the ACLU basically said, well, some guy posting photos of a young girl doesn't classify as child pornography. Therefore, we argue this bill is, quote, facially unconstitutional. Now, these legal terms need to be explained a bit. Facially unconstitutional refers to a government law, regulation, or rule that is deemed to be unconstitutional as written, as opposed to being unconstitutional as applied. In a facial challenge, a plaintiff, which would be ACLU in this case, is claiming that a statute is unconstitutional at all times, under all circumstances. If a statute is facially unconstitutional, the courts have stated that it cannot be enforced. Now, the ACLU argued that certain parts of the act were facially unconstitutional and sought a preliminary injunction preventing the government from enforcing those provisions. Now, the ACLU claimed that this legislation was, quote, an unconstitutional restriction on free speech. Yeah, the free speech of an old creep leaving comments on some teenager's Instagram photo. So it's not a wonder why the ACLU ran to the defense of so-called sex workers, because it's nothing but a bunch of wacky liberals, and was founded by a slew of women's rights activists in 1920. It may have originated from a noble place, but like most foundations or organizations, they have been hijacked by wackos. Let's continue, though. In 2023, Maine eliminated penalties for people who sell sex while keeping them in place for people who buy it. In 2019, Representative Ayanna Pressley proposed a resolution calling for all states to remove criminal and civil penalties for sex workers. Quote, sex work is work, Pressley said. In fact, sex work is often the only form of work for certain marginalized communities who are most vulnerable to housing and employment discrimination. Unquote. Pathetic. It would be a progressive Congress member who advocates for legalizing prostitution, right? And try to shield it by associating prostitution with racism somehow. Wow, insanity knows no bounds. Just disgusting. Translation: prostitution exists in these communities due to racism. Tell that to the white guy who drives a few miles to hook up with Shaniqua. Just kidding. But let's break this down. Sex work is not the only form of work for certain marginalized communities who are most vulnerable to housing and employment discrimination, because those communities, which mayors are responsible for, are the cause of it. So focus on leadership, right? Then, vulnerable to housing and employment discrimination? Okay, so we're just going to assume Presley is referring to the lower class communities, right? So we assume she's talking about women of color, that being primarily Black and Hispanic women. So in what city all across the country are Black and Hispanic women vulnerable to housing and employment discrimination? None, because in those very communities, they are the primary recipients of housing and employment. They make up the majority of state government housing, and they make up the majority of retail positions, from cashiers, shift leads, supervisors. Most of the jobs in the communities, Black and Hispanic women are the majority of employees. Where is the housing and employment discrimination? And even still, in those communities, there aren't too many white managers. It's mainly Black and Hispanic managers, so it would appear they're discriminating against each other, right? Nonsense. This is the elitism of the Democratic Party, insulting these communities, in claiming these sex workers are basically forced to sell their bodies, when in reality, they have the highest rate of obtaining employment in those communities. They have the easiest access to government programs that offer housing, healthcare, food, and even assistance in finding jobs. Oh, she doesn't mention those programs now, does she? Workforce programs that are located on every side of town in a city that is there to help individuals find employment. Oh, but those women are being discriminated against by the workforce, so they have to settle with becoming sex workers. Ayanna Presley wants women of color in the lower class communities to, quote, get that money by any means necessary, and I'll work hard in Congress to pass a law to decriminalize your lifestyle. She doesn't respect these women because if she did, she would be attempting to pass laws through Congress that helps these sex workers find jobs and grants for college. Oh no, it doesn't work that way. Because I actually dislike Black people in those communities. That's what's in Congress right now. Very dangerous individuals with power to get laws passed. But let's continue. Quote, between the lines. Harris has been reluctant to talk about some of the liberal positions she took during the 2020 Democratic primary. She has aggressively moved to the center on immigration, healthcare, and other issues since she declared her candidacy in July, after President Biden's abrupt withdrawal. Wait, stop creating this damn narrative. Harris never moved to the center. She is shifting to not drown in the deep waters. She doesn't believe nor stand by anything claimed to be a new position. And she didn't declare her candidacy. Someone else declared it for her. Harris or her aides have said she's changed positions on issues such as banning fracking and Medicare for all. She says she now opposes both. And the border wall, which she previously opposed but now backs as part of a bipartisan border security bill. Unquote. Okay, so why has she come out and so-called changed her position on these issues, but is quiet as a mouse when it comes to decriminalizing prostitution then? Because she wants to do it behind the shadows. It's included in some bill where it's cunningly nested, hidden behind some pseudo-name of a bill, such as the Workers' Integrity Act or some shit. But she knows, during her presidential campaign, it would lead to questions about her morality. Well, that's already been compromised. But as a woman, she knows that proposing a policy where she will decriminalize prostitution, it would ruin the image of womanhood, including mothers as well. And then you have to also factor in how young women would only be encouraged to be OnlyFans models even more so than now. And here you have a woman as the vice president pushing that. Listen, decriminalizing prostitution means the federal government will have their hands in on it, just like decriminalizing marijuana. If it's legal and money is involved, then the federal government is right there to collect their share of profits. How exactly would decriminalizing prostitution work under the federal laws in the labor force? How would sex workers file taxes? Wait, will they literally create a company that has a staff, payroll, and everything? Sex workers have to fill out I-9 forms upon hiring? They will be interviewed by a manager of the company? Who would own the company? Oh, is this where the small businesses come into play in Harris's tax deduction plan? I'm trying to figure this out because one or the other is going to happen. Decriminalized, or it will continue to be a issue left up to the states, which those states that have legalized it should be ashamed of themselves as well. But on a federal level, what will happen? It doesn't matter what would happen because a presidential candidate is advocating for decriminalizing it. Imagine if it were a Republican, I don't know, maybe Trump, who was advocating this. He would be considered sexist and only seeing women as sex objects. But on the left, oh, it's about liberation. It's about women being marginalized in discriminatory environments where they have to prostitute. It's so disgusting, it should make every woman sick to their stomachs. Speaking of stomachs, there is a direct correlation to prostitution and abortion, right? We all know prostitutes get pregnant as their clients pay more to have unprotected sex with them. But lo and behold, they hide this percentage of the abortion statistics because it would magnify that most of the women that are having abortions are irresponsible women and prostitutes. Yet Harris claims she would rather focus on arresting the Johns and pimps instead of the prostitutes? That's like saying she would rather focus on taking the guns away from the criminals, but not arresting the criminals. Regardless if they have the gun or not, they're still criminals. In other words, how can you arrest the other half of the equation? More so, if you arrest the Johns and the pimps, how would the prostitute make the money without the Johns and the pimps who manage the, quote, work environment? Just a bunch of blabbering nonsense. Listen, they have just given prostitution a more respectable title, that's all. Another thing that we've noticed is most of these same women are also feminists. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't having sex for money with men go against feminism? What happened to equality? That's not equality, that being treated equal as a human being. What scenario is at play here? Either prostitutes infiltrated the feminists movement, or the feminists movement has always been a group of undercover prostitutes. Something to ponder. And their so-called union is even demanding fair pay. Fair pay? How would that work? I mean, you can't force the John to pay you a specific amount. Either he pays or he doesn't. Oh wait, let me guess, you want the federal government to get involved. Oh right, that's what it's all about, remember? So Jane meets up with John and charges him $500 for her services. John is like, that's a bit steep. I can't pay you that much. I only have $250. Jane is like, I'm sorry, but my rate is my rate. But since her hours have been reduced, she provides those services for John, being paid $250. The next week, her coworker tells her she should apply for unemployment benefits due to her hours being reduced and the impact it's had on her monthly income. She applies for sex worker unemployment benefits, which they calculate how many hours she worked in the previous weeks, how much money she made having sex per work shift, and how many losers she had sex with per work shift. They calculate this amount, and that's how they determine how much Jane will receive in sex worker unemployment benefits. But they also have to factor in skills, experience, if you're qualified to do the job to even get the unemployment benefits. Heck, they may have to determine if you're even attractive enough to get the benefits. Insanity. And these benefits are what Kamala Harris wants for the sex workers, my friends. Oh yes, heck, they would even get sex workers tax credits. But she ran into a brick wall. That being a reality check. You see, what happened to Harris is she realized that the country is bigger than her bubble. The country is truly not aligned with those wacky ideals. And perhaps the main reality check is that just because you're a woman and a woman of color, it doesn't mean the American people will ignore your incompetence. I think that was the biggest mindfuck. She thought it was in the bag. Her staff and the Democrats basically said, we're going to tiptoe into the White House. Only hold debates on left-wing networks and only interviews on left-wing networks, and trust that identity politics will pull at the heartstrings of Americans. It's not working. And Harris has shown in these interviews she's dumbfounded. We mentioned this in a previous episode, but I think Kamala Harris would be wise to concede defeat to Donald Trump. It happens all the time in election cycles. Candidates drop out of races and even concede defeat and endorse their opponents. Harris should think about her political future. We can say that her vehicle can be fixed. We've been a bit brutal. but in the political matrix, she is in fact a key player, sad but true. Concede defeat, address the nation as vice president in a State of the Union address, and let them know that you are conceding defeat in the presidential race. Speak from your heart, speak from a place that allows you to express yourself genuinely, and the American people will embrace it. It would be the best thing Harris had ever done as vice president, which would be one of the strongest character builders for her political career. Yeah, she'll get backlash from the Democratic Party and even mainstream media, but the American people would recognize this humble moment, and she would in fact gain respect for that decision. But we all know this is likely not going to happen. Instead, Harris will keep ramming her head against the wall, which only magnifies that stupidity of continuing to fight a losing battle. Democrats tried to sneak Harris through the back door, but the American people spotted her. The early so-called radiance during her rallies, the wacky liberation of Tim Walz jumping around pumping up the zombies, has worn off. And it's because you can't have a campaign running on joyful optics. Sure, the zombies are lock, stock, and barrel, they're irrelevant. But the actual human beings who were staring at Harris with that displeased facial expression, it's still there. She hasn't convinced them of anything. In fact, she's made it even worse. And the reason she seems oblivious to the issues and is constantly avoiding answering the main questions is because it's old Joe 2.0. Anybody but Trump was their policy. Kamala Harris was a part of that anybody but Trump administration. So of course, she is a reflection of old Joe. The difference, and it sucks for her, is that old Joe actually gets a pass with his flaws. It's because he's 200 years old. Harris is running on equity. Now that's what her economic plan is, and she's trying to be very elusive about it, but it's leaking out every time she is getting stumped in these interviews. She can't propose such a plan because it's divisive for the nation, and it will definitely promote racial tension with all races of people, to be honest. So when she's asked about her opportunity economic plan, she goes into blabbermouth because she will never say, hey, I'm going to give non-white people $25,000 in federal grants to buy a home, or I'm going to give non-white people up to $50,000 in tax deductions so they can skip a few steps in obtaining wealth in America, like their white counterparts. Of course, she won't come out and say that because she'd be kicked to the curb just like old Joe was. In the analysis, of course, everyone is calling her incompetent, inadequate, and such. We have as well. It's how it plays out. But the truth of the matter, Harris is tight-lipped because the vision she has for America is destructive, divisive, and a threat to democracy. Take your guns, take over businesses, extreme tax hikes, which will definitely increase unemployment, legalize prostitution, legalize marijuana, free college tuition, dump out tax credits, loans, gender reassignment surgery for illegal immigrant inmates who more than likely raped or murdered the same gender they're trying to become. I mean, it's an insane asylum, and that's why Harris is very evasive. But it's already been exposed in general. Power comes in two ways, through virtue or through vanity. And we know which one Harris chose. Vanity of being adored, celebrated, praised, empowered. Well, the fall from vanity is exactly what happened to old Joe, and Harris will fall even further. We all know the saying, you should quit while you're ahead, right? Well, in Kamala Harris' case, she should quit while she's behind. This is the chaos sector.